If you've ever tried to learn a new language, you know that it can be quite difficult. I've recently tried learning Swedish and it's tough. It's tough because I am unfamiliar with the conventions that the Swedes use to formulate their sentences. I'm unfamiliar with the vocabulary that people in Sweden use. I'm unfamiliar with the way people pronounce their words. All of these things I just need to learn. There's no easy way around that. What I need to do is effectively memorize for each of the words, or at least the common words in the language, what they mean. And I need to internalize, either explicitly or just by practicing, the rules of grammar, structure of the sentences that are used in the Swedish language. If I got those two things and I get the pronunciation right, then I am able to form sentences in Swedish that Swedish speakers can understand. So linguistic communication is built on linguistic competence. Linguistic competence basically involves knowledge of a vocabulary and a knowledge of the rules of sentence composition. What about pictures? There doesn't seem to be anything like that. What is interesting is that I can go to a gallery in Spain, China, Australia, or South Africa, look at the paintings on the walls, and by and large, get their meaning. Of course, there are lots of cultural conventions coming in as soon as we start considering sophisticated imagery, imagery that is communicating in a subtle way. I'm moving those aside. A picture of a dog in any of these galleries is something that I can recognize as a picture of a dog. I can see the dog in that picture. Why? Not because I have learned the conventions of the pictorial cultures in all of those countries. Not because there is a universal pictorial culture, but because pictures work in a completely different way. If I know what a dog is and I know how to recognize one when I see one on the street, I can probably tell when something is a picture of a dog, if it's done in anything like a lifelike way. Now you might think that there is an important way in which I get this wrong. I'm too simplistic. If you look at the way pictures work, you see that there very frequently are lots of symbolic references going on that you do need conventional knowledge for. A good example is the pictorial culture of the Middle Ages in Europe. If you're familiar with those pictures, often you will find saints depicted by means of certain attributes. So you will see a person who looks fairly generic holding a pair of eyes, for example. And you might, on the basis of that, recognize who it is. It's the convention for representing Saint Lucia. If you don't know this convention, you wouldn't be able to get that meaning. Now, I grant that. So, in a sense, this is part of what I meant when I said that lots of cultural influences enter into more sophisticated imagery. So the entire sphere of iconography, which is basically the use of symbols in pictures, is indeed through and through conventional. But notice what is going on. When we identify the symbol in the picture of the saint, so when we say the eyes stand for Saint Lucia, we're doing so already from the world of the picture. So we're already, in a way, transposed into the represented scene, and we see these eyes in the way that we step into the room and see the bed and the rug when we look at its contents. So the symbolism of iconography is only possible because of pictorial representation. It can't really help us explain pictorial representation. So this is why the conventional connections of symbolism often are of no use in explaining how pictures represent. Pictures represent in this very spontaneous way, where you could say as soon as we've got a visual recognitional capacity for certain items, we are able to understand pictures of that items. And that is quite striking. And it works from a really early age. I mean, studies have been done with very young infants, and it is remarkable how early and how easily young children are able to understand the meaning communicated in picture books. They're able to see what these pictures show them. As a consequence of this, pictorial representation has no need for structural features to encode the meanings in the way that we find in sentences. So syntax is the word that linguists use to describe the structural properties of sentences. You could think that by and large, the meaning of a sentence depends on its syntax, on the way it is structured. Sometimes people say it in this way: syntax determines semantics, by which they mean syntax determines meaning. Meaning and semantics are often used interchangeably. Do we have syntax in pictures? Well, I don't think so. There is no interesting structure to a picture. You could think that although a sentence can be decomposed into specific word types that each fulfill a function, so you've got the verb, you've got the noun, you might have a predicate or a name. In the picture, everything is equal. Every part of the surface plays an equal role in realizing the representational properties. And again, keep in mind that as soon as you want to say, no, but this is more important because this is the cow, or this is the tree that is really important in this scene, we're already stepping into the world of the picture. So we've already identified objects within the representation. At the level of the surface features, it is just an array of colors and shapes, and each of these has a contribution to its representational properties. Maybe the only interesting principle that we can identify is what is sometimes called the picture principle, as a principle of pictorial syntax. And this is the principle that each part of a picture represents part of what the overall picture represents. So if I've got a picture of a landscape and I cut it up in whatever way I like, because there's no right or wrong way of cutting up a picture, then each little part that I end up with will be just a representation of part of that landscape. And I think that is right. That is true. Although you might think if you go to a very, very small level, the representational features of the picture might disappear entirely. So if you end up with just a little bit of paper with some green pigment on it, you might say this is no longer a picture of anything, even though when placed in this larger whole, it is part of a picture of a landscape. What this shows is that it is not possible, it seems, to explain how pictures get their meaning from the bottom up, so to say. So it's really not going to work to say, well, just take the smallest part. If you think of a digital picture, you can focus on the pixel. Take your pixel. Here we've got a red pixel. Here we've got a green pixel. Here we've got a yellow pixel. Those are the fundamental bearers of pictorial meaning. And put them together in the right way, and you get a larger whole that encodes a more complicated meaning. It doesn't work that way because the smallest parts are probably not pictures. And if they are pictures, then I doubt that they really are the smallest parts, because every picture can be cut up in some way or other. So this bottom-up strategy of explaining how pictures get their meaning doesn't work. And this is why, if you're interested in the question of how is it that pictorial representations get meaning, given that it's not in the way that language gets its meaning, you really have to find another solution, because that bottom-up strategy is not available. The syntax semantic strategy that you find in language, where we've got a vocabulary and a dictionary and a grammar, is not available. So what are you going to say? It seems that one option is to deny that pictures are meaningful, which is, I think, a very hard price to pay. So we need to find another principle that explains how it is that a surface with some paint on it can come to encode meaning. And this is why the resemblance theory has been such a strong force in thinking about pictures. So people who have come to the question of pictorial representation from this route, thinking about the question how pictures acquire meaning, seem almost forced to say something like, well, it is because the parts, and now not the smallest parts, but some parts of the picture resemble some parts of the object that they represent. So now there is a similarity identified between parts of the picture and part of the scene represented. And so we're not starting completely bottom up. We start sort of midway. So take the landscape painting. You might, as a resemblance theorist, identify the part of the painting that represents a tree and remark that the shape that the painting has is in fact the shape that the tree has, that the color or the color pattern that the painting has here is in fact or resembles the color pattern that the tree has. And you could think that by this means do we here have the import of some kind of meaning to the painting. So resemblance might itself be a generator of meaning. So now you've got one influential answer to the question, what is distinctive of pictorial representation? It is resemblance. I'm not sure if it's the right answer, but many people have found it appealing. And you see that the answer to the question is very much motivated by a puzzle about how meaning comes about in pictures. If it's not by convention, and if it is not enough to identify these very small, tiny units in pictures that can somehow generate the meanings, it doesn't come from the pixels, then the idea that pictures represent by resemblance at least gives you something like an answer to that question, how the pictorial meaning comes about, how it comes into existence in the first place. As an answer, it's not enough. More needs to be said. Why is that? Well, think of it this way. Everything that has a shape and a color visually resembles other things. But not everything that has a shape and a color is a picture. So I am not a picture. The wall behind me is not a picture. Even though I visually resemble all kinds of things and the wall behind me does so too. So we need to say something about what makes it that something that bears visual resemblance to other things becomes a picture. And here you might think is a role for intention. The purposes and plans of the person who is responsible for the picture, who serves up the picture to others to see. So it might be that something is a picture because it was intended to have these visual resemblances, and for those visual resemblances also to be recognized by a viewer. At that level, you could see pictures wouldn't function very differently from language, because also with language you could think it is very important that we think of this as an intentional phenomenon, something that people do on purpose. When I communicate with language, I formulate sentences that not only have meanings because of their conventional associations and their dictionary meanings, but it's also very much the idea that I intend my audience to recognize those meanings, that I know that my audience will appreciate what my words mean, so that the communication that I have with them is going well. that structure where I sort of, as a speaker or a writer, have expectations of how people will respond to my words and what they will understand when I write the things that I write or say the things that I say, is very much part of how we use language. And it sort of comes on top of this story about dictionaries and syntax and grammar. So you could see that if we answer that pictorial representation works via resemblance, we can also build on top this communicative practice where pictures are created with certain intentions, with the idea that a viewer will actually understand the picture in a specific way, in the right way, to make a certain kind of pictorial communication possible. All of that framework, which you could call broadly a conventional framework, can be built on top of this core idea of resemblance. So when you encounter people defending the idea that pictorial representation is a matter of resemblance, you will see that the core idea of resemblance is typically supplemented in that way to make for an adequate explanation of how pictures represent.